My daughter stood at the altar shaking, her eyes begging me for a way out she was too afraid to take. The music kept playing, the guests kept smiling, but I saw her breaking in real time. So I leaned in, squeezed her hand, and whispered three words that shattered the entire wedding. Your life first.
My name is Camille Brooks, and this is the story of how I watched my daughter nearly marry into a family that wanted to erase her, and how I helped her reclaim herself before it was too late. I was 53 when my only daughter, Layla Brooks, told me she was getting married, and I remember the exact way her voice lifted at the end of the sentence, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. Darius Cole looked perfect from the outside, the kind of man people praised because he dressed well, spoke softly, and carried himself like every room belonged to him. At first, I tried to trust what my daughter saw in him, but from the very beginning, something inside me tightened whenever his family entered the picture, especially his mother, Regina, whose smile never touched her eyes and whose compliments always landed like corrections waiting to happen. I kept telling myself I might be imagining it, clinging to hope the way mothers do when we want our children to be loved fully and without conditions. But small things accumulated like dust on a neglected shelf. Regina laughed lightly, almost musically, whenever Lila spoke passionately about her artwork, calling it cute expression pieces, as if my daughter were still in kindergarten. Then came the remarks about our family being lively and casual, said with the tone of someone politely declining a dish they found unappetizing. Darius never pushed back. Instead, he placed his hand on Lila's knee and whispered, "Baby, don't take it personally. My mom just wants everything to be perfect." I watched my daughter soften herself, folding corners of her personality down to make room for their expectations. One afternoon after a Sunday brunch, I saw the first real crack in my daughter's confidence. Lila climbed into my car looking like someone had pulled the color out of her. She said Regina had hinted, again, that the wedding should be at their upscale club so the photographs would look timeless, and then suggested, in the gentlest of tones, that our relatives might not fit the aesthetic. When my daughter repeated those words, her voice sounded like paper beginning to tear. I wanted to tell her she didn't owe those people a damn thing, but I also saw how much she wanted this marriage to work, how hard she was trying to keep the peace. So I swallowed my anger and said, "If you're happy, I'm happy." But when she stepped out of the car, I gripped the steering wheel and wondered when love had started sounding so much like shrinking. As the engagement months passed, the red flags grew brighter. Lila stopped talking about her upcoming art exhibit. She stopped wearing her natural curls because Regina once commented that straight hair photographs more elegantly. At a family dinner, I watched Darius interrupt her mid-sentence to translate her own opinion for the table, as if her voice needed refinement. She laughed it off, but her eyes darted toward me for half a second, pleading silently for something neither of us knew how to name yet. The final confirmation came at a large engagement celebration his family hosted, complete with crystal centerpieces and linen napkins folded like swans. I noticed how often people looked at me with polite curiosity, as if trying to place me somewhere on their imaginary social chart. When I walked up to join a conversation Regina was having with two other women, they all fell silent for just a shade too long before giving me identical, overly sweet smiles. I stood there, smiling back, pretending not to feel the sting. But inside, something old and familiar resurfaced. The memory of working 2 jobs to keep Lila in good schools, of fighting for every space she grew in, of protecting her from anyone who tried to dim her brightness. Later that night, Lila asked if I thought Regina liked her. I lied gently because what mother wants to tell her child that the family she's marrying into sees her as a project rather than a person? She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I just really want them to accept me, Mama." It was that moment, more than the comments, more than the posture corrections, more than the subtle digs, when I realized how deep their influence had already seeped. I drove home with a tightness in my chest that stayed with me for weeks. I tried to talk myself out of my fears, telling myself that every family had difficult personalities, that wedding stress made people say strange things. But when I closed my eyes at night, I kept seeing my daughter folding herself smaller and smaller and smaller until one day there would be nothing left of the girl who painted murals on her bedroom walls and believed her voice could shake the world. And somewhere between those nights and the wedding countdown, the hurt turned into something heavier, the fear that if I didn't act, I would lose my daughter, not to tragedy, but to a life that demanded she dim everything that made her who she was. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over, cracking the polished facade the Cole family worked so hard to maintain. The night of the final planning dinner, I arrived with the hope, thin as it was, that maybe things would go smoothly, that maybe I'd misjudged them, that maybe my daughter's future wouldn't be built on the foundation of other people's silent condescension. But the moment I walked into the venue, I felt the shift in the air. Conversations dimmed slightly when I passed, smiles tightened, and Regina greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt like a cold coin pressed to my skin. Later, as I stepped into the hallway to wash my hands, I heard voices drifting from a private room whose door hadn't fully latched. I recognized Regina's tone instantly, smooth, authoritative, dripping with the kind of certainty only someone who had never been challenged could possess. "She's sweet," Regina was saying, "but she's not on our level. Once the ring is on, we'll polish her up. New wardrobe, new friends, maybe even etiquette classes. She'll thank us eventually." A woman beside her laughed softly, the sound sharp as glass. And her mama, she still looks like she works double shifts. No wonder the girl doesn't know how to carry herself properly. For a moment, the world tilted. I felt heat crawl up my neck, a flash of the anger I'd buried for months. My hands curled into fists, and I almost pushed that door open. I almost let them see the fire they claimed I didn't have. But then I heard a voice that froze me in place. My daughter's. "I can change, Mrs. Cole," Lila whispered, her tone small, desperate, nothing like the woman I raised. "I've told my mom we might have to limit my side of the guest list. I don't want to embarrass you or Darius." Silence hung for a breath before Regina replied in a calm, satisfied sigh. "That's a good girl. This family is a step up for you. We're just trying to help you elevate." In that moment, something inside me broke cleanly, like a bone refusing to bend any further. This wasn't just about control. This was erasure, deliberate, calculated, and wrapped in civility. They weren't just adjusting my daughter. They were remaking her from the inside out. I backed away from the door, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I returned to the dinner table, Lila's face lit up as though she'd been waiting for me. She asked what I thought of the floral arrangements, if the menu felt warm enough, if I liked the seating chart. Her eyes searched mine for approval, unaware that I had just overheard her begging for acceptance from people who saw her as raw material. "Everything looks lovely," I said, forcing my lips into a smile. She didn't need to see me shaking. She didn't need to see the storm forming inside me. Not yet. But the humiliation didn't end there. As dinner progressed, Regina held court at the head of the table, telling stories about Darius's childhood achievements, accolades delivered like royal announcements. At one point, she gestured toward Lila with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Of course, once she's part of the family, we'll guide her toward more refined hobbies, something elegant. A few guests chuckled politely. Someone murmured, "She'll learn," as though my daughter were a stray being taught house rules. I kept my face neutral, but inside, every word landed like a stone. Darius sat beside Lila, nodding along, offering no correction, no protection, no acknowledgement that the woman beside him was shrinking by the minute. The final blow came when Regina raised her glass and said, "To new beginnings, and to helping Lila become the woman she has the potential to be." It sounded like a toast, but it was a verdict. That night, when we finally reached our cars, Lila hugged me tightly. "Mama, did I do okay tonight?" she asked, voice trembling under the surface. I brushed her cheek lightly. "You were perfect." She smiled, relieved, unaware of the fire spiraling through my chest. I watched her drive away, swallowed by the glow of streetlights, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't step in, those people would break her spirit piece by fragile piece. And worse, they would do it with her quiet permission, because she believed that love required her to be less than who she was. I sat behind my steering wheel for a long time, hands gripping the leather until my knuckles whitened, thinking about every moment she had dimmed herself, every time I had urged patience, every insult I had smoothed over. My silence had protected her peace, but it had also given these people space to claim her as theirs. And that night, I vowed that they would not have her. Not like this. Not ever. The morning after that planning dinner, I woke up with the kind of headache that feels like it sits behind your eyes instead of your forehead. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word I had heard through that half-open door. "She's not on our level. Her mama looks like she still works double shifts." It wasn't just the insult. It was the calm certainty in Regina's tone, the way everyone else in the room seemed to accept her judgment as fact. For years, I had taught Lila to work hard, to stay kind, to hold her head high, and now she was bending herself into knots for people who saw her as something that needed to be fixed. I realized then that waiting, hoping, praying they would soften was no longer an option. I started small, with the only person in that family who had ever made eye contact with me like I was her equal. Darius's aunt, Monique, called me later that day to check in about centerpieces. Her voice was tired in a way nurses' voices often are. I recognized it from my own days of long shifts and late buses. I took a breath and decided I was done speaking around the wound. "Monique," I said quietly, "I overheard something last night. About Lila, about me. There was a pause, the sound of her moving into a quieter room, and then she said, "Tell me." I described the conversation word for word, repeating Regina's phrases as if I were holding up pieces of broken glass. Monique didn't rush to defend her sister-in-law, didn't tell me I must have misunderstood. I heard her exhale slowly. "I believe you," she answered. "Regina's always chased status. She loves molding people, and she thinks she's doing them a favor." Her voice dropped even lower. "But Lila looks tired, Camille. I noticed. Dark circles, that smile that doesn't reach her eyes. I thought it was just wedding stress, but now..." For a moment, I considered letting my anger spill out fully, telling Monique everything I'd wanted to say for months. Instead, I swallowed it and shifted to the one thing that mattered. "I'm afraid that if she marries into this, you're all going to strip her down until she doesn't know herself anymore." Monique was quiet for a long time. "You might be the only person she'll still listen to," she finally said. "Regina has a way of making people believe she knows best. Even Darius, he thinks she's just being protective." That conversation planted the seed for what came next. I realized I couldn't just step in at the altar and drag my daughter away, no matter how much I wanted to. If I did that without proof, they'd paint me as the hysterical mother who couldn't let go, and Lila, already halfway inside their orbit, might push me out of her life for good. I needed the truth to speak louder than their polished stories. I needed them to condemn themselves using their own words. Over the next few days, I played the part everyone expected of me. I attended menu tastings, answered texts about family seating, smiled when Lila asked if I thought the bridesmaids' dresses were elegant enough. But underneath, something in me had gone very still and very sharp. I started paying close attention, not just to what Regina said, but to when and where she said it. I noticed she relaxed around certain people, an older cousin, 2 longtime friends from her social club, and that her tongue loosened after the second glass of wine. I noticed how, when staff were around, she was sugary and gracious, but once they stepped away, her real commentary slipped out in quick, cutting lines. I bought a small voice recorder one afternoon. Nothing fancy, just something that could sit quietly in my purse or pocket. The clerk didn't ask questions. To him, I was just another middle-aged woman buying electronics. But as I walked back to my car, the weight of the device in my hand felt like more than plastic and metal. It felt like a decision. In my mind, I heard my own mother's voice warning me to stay out of other people's business, to avoid making enemies. Then I heard Regina's voice layered over it, talking about etiquette classes for my daughter. Between those 2 women, I chose myself. I chose my child. The first time I tried to record something, my hands trembled. It was a final dress fitting, all satin and mirrors and staged enthusiasm. Regina stood with her friends at the back of the boutique, evaluating Lila like she was a display piece. "She'll look beautiful," one of them said, "with the right posture." "Exactly," Regina murmured. "We'll work on her walk after the wedding. Darius deserves a wife who represents the family properly." I slipped my hand into my purse, clicked the recorder on, and set the bag near their chairs as if I were just freeing my shoulder. My heart beat so loud in my ears that I barely heard the rest of their conversation. But I kept my face neutral, nodding when Lila spun around, forcing warmth into my voice when I told her she looked stunning. When the appointment ended, my fingers brushed the recorder again, and I felt a strange mix of guilt and grim satisfaction. That night, alone in my kitchen, I pressed play. The tinny sound filled the room, fabric rustling, low voices, then Regina's words, clearer now. She's a sweet girl, but she's rough around the edges. Once she's ours, we'll refine her. New friends, better circles, she'll forget where she came from. I stopped the recording and leaned against the counter, breathing slowly. It wasn't enough yet, but it was something. A mirror held up to the way they really thought. Over the following week, I gathered more pieces. At a planning meeting, I left my purse under the table near Regina's chair. When she thought we were discussing floral budgets, she drifted off into comments about how some of my relatives didn't know how to present themselves and suggested quietly that perhaps they could be seated near the back so the photographs focus on the right areas. At another gathering, she joked that once Lila became a Cole, Brooks will just sound like a chapter we've outgrown. Every time, my chest tightened, but I kept my voice even and my hands steady. The risk came one evening at their house during a smaller family dinner meant to practice the ceremony order. I arrived early and helped place name cards, watching Regina glide from room to room giving instructions. At one point, she and Darius stepped into the sitting room to discuss who would walk his grandmother down the aisle. I knew their pattern by now. Decisions like that often led to little jokes, little barbs about what would look tasteful. My fingers brushed the recorder in my pocket, almost on instinct. I walked into the room carrying a stack of napkins, set them on a side table, and accidentally left my purse on the sofa arm near where Regina liked to sit. When she and Darius returned, I excused myself to the hallway under the pretense of checking a message. From my spot just out of sight, I heard Regina's voice drift over. "I'm still worried about her mother," she said. "She has that working woman energy. Always looks like she's on her way to a shift. I don't want that in the front pew of the photos." Darius chuckled in that low way of his. "Mom, you're overthinking. Layla loves her." "That's precisely the problem," Regina replied, and I could hear the ice in her tone. "We spent years building a certain standing. We can't have people looking at our family and wondering where we picked them up. I just wish Layla had come from a different background. It would have made things simpler." My jaw clenched. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Then I heard the faint scrape of a purse zipper and froze. "Whose bag is this?" Regina asked. Blood roared in my ears. If she found the recorder, everything would implode before I had a chance to protect Lila. I stepped back into the doorway as casually as I could manage. "Oh, that's mine," I said lightly, crossing the room to scoop it up. "I keep setting it down and forgetting it. Story of my life." Regina gave me a searching look, her eyes narrowing just enough to let me know she suspected something, even if she couldn't name it. Darius smiled politely, oblivious. "We were just talking about the ceremony order," he said. "Of course," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Whatever works best for your family." Later, when I was alone in my car, I pressed play again. This time, the recording captured both Regina's disdain and Darius's silence, his soft agreement, his unwillingness to defend either me or Lila. That, more than anything, solidified what I already knew. My daughter wasn't just marrying into a difficult mother-in-law. She was marrying a man who would always stand where the power pointed, not where love demanded. That night, I did something I'd been thinking about ever since the planning dinner. I pulled an overnight bag from my closet and packed it with my daughter in mind. Soft sweatpants she could collapse into, comfortable flats, a change of clothes that didn't belong to anyone's idea of perfection but hers. I added copies of her important documents I kept in my file cabinet, her passport, even a small tin with the emergency cash I had tucked away over the years. I set the bag by the front door, looked at it for a long time, and whispered to the empty house, "If she chooses herself, I have to be ready." In the days that followed, the wedding machine kept turning. Cake tastings, final payments, text threads about hair and makeup slots. On the surface, nothing had changed. Lila still smiled in pictures, still sent me screenshots of bridesmaid dress options, still tried to smooth every edge of this union into something presentable. But when she came over one evening and fell asleep on my couch halfway through a movie, I noticed the tension in her jaw even in rest, the way her hands stayed clenched around her phone as if she were afraid to miss a message. I watched her sleep and thought, my silence taught you to make yourself smaller to keep the peace. My voice is going to have to help you break free. I didn't know exactly how it would happen yet, only that the moment would come. A crack in her resolve, a whisper of doubt, a second where fear and love collided in her chest, and she would look at me not as the mother who wanted her to be polite, but as the woman who had survived enough to know when a life was about to turn into a cage. Until that second came, I would keep gathering truth and holding it close. I would wait with my overnight bag by the door, my recordings saved in a folder, my heart ready to say the words she needed, even if they shattered the life she thought she wanted. Because I understood something now that I hadn't wanted to face before. Sometimes a mother's love isn't about smoothing the path in front of her child. Sometimes it's about standing beside them at the edge of a cliff and being willing to say, "Don't jump," even when everyone else is urging them forward. The morning of the wedding dawned with a strange, heavy stillness, the kind that settles over a house before a storm. I woke before my alarm, sat at the edge of my bed, and listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My overnight bag still sat by the door, packed, ready, waiting. Its presence a reminder that today could end in one of two ways, with my daughter bound to people who meant to reshape her, or with her walking away from all of it. I didn't know which it would be. I only knew I had to be strong enough to hold her through whichever choice she made. At the bridal suite, Lila stood before the mirror in her gown, breathtaking and brittle at the same time. The satin hugged her shoulders beautifully. The veil framed her face like a soft promise, but her eyes were hollow. I saw the girl who used to paint on her jeans because she couldn't wait to express what was inside her. That girl was shrinking inside this dress, inside this day. I walked up behind her and placed my hands on her shoulders. "Baby, breathe," I whispered. She exhaled shakily, her reflection trembling. "Mama," she murmured, "I feel like I'm walking into something I can't come back from." "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," I told her, voice low and steady. Before she could answer, the coordinator burst in, her cheerful tone polished, unaware of the fracture spreading beneath the surface. "We're starting in 10 minutes. Everyone to their places. Lila nodded mechanically, but her hands shook as she adjusted the lace on her sleeve. I could feel her panic growing like a living pulse. When the doors finally opened, the music swelled and the room erupted in admiration for the dazzling bride stepping forward. Everyone saw beauty. No one saw the fear coiled around her ribs. She clutched my hand so tight, the bones pressed together. Each step forward felt like a mile. Halfway down the aisle, her breath started to hitch. "Mama, I'm scared," she whispered through trembling lips. "I can't do this." I turned my head slightly, just enough for her to hear me, just enough to anchor her. "Your life first," I said, 3 words. Calm, final, true. Something shifted inside her, a clarity, a spark, a memory of who she used to be. She stopped walking. Guests murmured in confusion. The music faltered. From the front pew, Regina stood abruptly, her face tightening as if she sensed that control slipping from her hands. Then Lila did the bravest thing I've ever seen. She lifted the hem of her gown, turned away from the altar, and walked straight back up the aisle. Gasps echoed like a wave. People stood. Someone dropped a program. All the while, Regina hissed sharply, "Lila, get back here! Do not make a scene!" But my daughter didn't stop. She pushed through the side doors into the courtyard, and I followed her into the sunlight. The moment the door swung shut behind us, she let out a sob that wasn't sorrow, it was release. "I won't marry into people who hate who I am," she said, breathless. "I can't spend my life being someone they approve of." Before I could answer, the doors opened again, but this time it wasn't a chase. It was Monique, holding the wedding planner's tablet tightly. Her eyes met mine with silent understanding. "It's time," she whispered, and then she pressed play. From inside the hall, speakers crackled to life. A familiar voice filled the room, Regina's. Word for word, tone for tone, the recording exposed everything she had tried to hide behind politeness and respectability. "She's not on our level. We'll polish her up. New friends, new wardrobe. Once she's ours, she'll forget where she came from." The courtyard doors weren't thick enough to block out the uproar. Guests gasped. Someone shouted, "Is that Regina?" Chairs scraped the floor. Footsteps shuffled. Inside, Darius stood frozen at the altar, his face drained of confidence. For a moment, he looked like a child watching the collapse of a structure he'd taken for granted his entire life. Regina's shock morphed into denial. "This is taken out of context." Then into anger. "Turn that off right now." Then into something like fear as people backed away from her, whispering. And through it all, Lila stood beside me, shoulders back, breathing steadily for the first time in months. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was reclaiming herself, piece by piece, breath by breath. When Darius finally stepped outside, his voice cracked as he said, "Lila, please, we can talk about this." She lifted her hand, stopping him. "If you couldn't defend me then," she said softly, "you won't defend me now." He lowered his gaze, defeated. The mask had slipped, and without it, he looked small. I reached for my daughter's hand, and she took it firmly. The wind lifted her veil as if helping her walk away. She turned from the hall, from the whispers, from the people who had tried to shape her life, and stepped into the sunlight with her chin lifted. And for the first time since the engagement began, I saw my daughter, her real self, standing tall and unbroken. When we left that venue, the noise stayed behind us, but it echoed in my head for days. The sound of the recording playing over the speakers, the gasps from the guests, Regina's voice shouting over her own words, trying to smother them under fresh lies. It all felt surreal, like a movie I'd watched instead of a moment I'd lived through. Yet the weight of what had happened settled into my bones slowly, like rain soaking through fabric. I had spent months smoothing edges, swallowing insults, telling myself to keep the peace, and it all ended in a single moment where my daughter chose herself, and I chose to stand with her no matter who we angered. The first night after the non-wedding, our house was quiet in a way I hadn't felt since Lila was a little girl. She sat at the kitchen table in one of my old t-shirts, face scrubbed clean, hair wrapped up, bare fingers twisting around a mug of tea. The gown, the veil, all the decorations that were supposed to mark the beginning of her new life felt like props from a performance we'd canceled at the last second. She stared down into the steam and finally said, "I keep thinking about all the times I laughed off the things they said. All the times I told myself, it's fine, they don't mean it." I sat across from her, hands wrapped around my own mug. "We both did that," I admitted. "We both pretended it didn't hurt because we didn't want to start a war." She looked up at me, eyes glistening. "Do you ever feel like all that pretending kinda gave them permission?" Her question landed like a stone in my chest because it was the same thought that had been haunting me since we walked out of that hall. I remembered every moment I'd bitten my tongue, when Regina rephrased Lila's sentences at the table, when her friends joked about upgrading my daughter, when someone suggested my side of the family be seated where they wouldn't clutter the photos. I had smiled, swallowed, told myself I'd talk to Lila later. My silence had been a shield, but it had also been a green light. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think my silence made it easier for them to believe they could keep pushing. But I also know I stayed quiet because I was scared. Scared of losing access to you. Scared you'd choose them if I made you choose. Sometimes we stay silent to survive, baby. It doesn't mean we were weak. It just means we were trying to make it through." Lila's shoulders sagged in a way that looked like relief and grief intertwined. "I wanted them to like me so badly," she whispered. "I kept thinking if I just adjusted one more thing, my hair, my clothes, my laugh, they'd finally see me as good enough. And every time I changed something, they just moved the line again." "That's what people like that do," I answered. "They don't want you to fit in. They want you to forget who you were before them." In the days that followed, pieces of what happened at the venue reached us through cousins, old friends, even a neighbor whose coworker had attended. People described the fallout like a slow-motion collapse. When the recording first played, there was a beat of stunned silence, followed by a murmur rolling across the room. Some guests stared at Regina as if seeing her for the first time, their carefully curated image of her cracking right down the middle. Others avoided her eyes, focusing on their phones, suddenly desperate to look busy. I heard how Regina's reactions moved in sharp stages. First came denial. Someone manipulated that audio. Then anger. "Turn this off immediately. This is private family business." Then a brittle attempted justification. "I was only talking about helping her fit into our world. You're all overreacting." Every excuse she made seemed to land worse than the last. It wasn't just that her words had been ugly, it was that they were spoken with so much calm certainty. People recognized the tone of someone who believed they were untouchable. Darius, they said, stood there with his jaw tight, eyes darting between the speakers and his mother. When a cousin quietly asked, "Man, you knew about this?" he didn't answer. That silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. For years, he'd let his mother talk that way and never pushed back. In that moment, everyone saw it. The golden son, the perfect fiancé, the man who was supposed to be steady, he just stood there, pinned by his own lack of courage. Over the following weeks, the Cole family's carefully polished reputation began to fray. Regina's social club temporarily suspended her from a leadership position, using vague language about internal concerns. A charity board she chaired decided to rotate new faces into visible roles. Women who once bragged about being invited to her luncheons stopped mentioning her name at all. A few even reached out to people they knew had been at the wedding, asking cautious questions. Word travels fastest when people smell a fall from grace. At the same time, there were quieter shifts. Monique called me one evening from a parked car, her voice low. "They're trying to make you and Lila the villains," she said, "saying you both overreacted, that the recording humiliated the family unnecessarily. But even in our house, people are looking at Regina differently. They might not say it out loud yet, but they heard her. They know." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked gently. "Because I wish I'd told you sooner," she replied. "I saw the way she talked to Lila. I saw the changes. I kept my head down to keep the peace, and now I have to look at myself knowing I helped keep the whole act going." Her words mirrored the ache in my own chest. Silence, I realized, had been a shared currency. We'd all used it, all paid with pieces of ourselves. The difference now was that some of us were done buying anything with it. For Lila, the aftermath came in waves. Some days she moved easily, laughing at shows we watched together, sending sketches to a friend who owned a small gallery, talking about rebooking her canceled exhibit. Other days, she sat by the window for hours, eyes unfocused, replaying conversations with Darius she couldn't erase. "He never defended me, Mama," she said once, turning her engagement ring over in her palm before finally placing it in a small dish on the counter. "Not once, and I kept telling myself he would if it really mattered. Turns out, I didn't matter enough." "You mattered more than his comfort," I corrected softly. "He just wasn't brave enough to choose you over what was easy." Her phone buzzed often at first, calls and messages from unknown numbers, flowers delivered with vague notes from his side of the family, all saying the same thing without saying it outright. Move on, smooth this over, pretend it wasn't as bad as it looked. Lila read a few, then stopped. Eventually, she asked me, "Is it wrong that I don't want to respond? That I don't want to explain myself to any of them?" "No," I said. "You don't owe an explanation to people who watched you shrink and never asked if you were okay." As the chatter around the incident slowly cooled into background gossip, something inside my daughter began to shift. One evening, weeks later, we sat on the porch watching the sky turn from orange to purple. She broke the comfortable silence with a thought that had clearly been building. I spent so long thinking my silence meant I was weak, she said, that if I spoke up, I'd be causing drama, being difficult, making things worse. But now I can see. Staying quiet was the only way I knew to protect myself while I was still trying to keep everyone else happy. I listened, letting her shape the thought fully. Back then, she continued, if I'd called Regina out, I would have been painted as ungrateful, emotional, disrespectful. My silence was like armor, thin, cracked armor, but still, it kept me going until I was ready to walk away. And then, at the altar, choosing to speak, choosing to move, choosing to leave, it wasn't about revenge. It was about not dying slowly in a life that wasn't mine. I felt a swell of pride so strong it nearly hurt. You didn't just not go through with the wedding, I told her. You chose yourself over their approval. That's not something they taught you. That's something you grew on your own. There were consequences, of course, but not the kind we once feared. No one stormed our house. No one tried to drag us into court over vendor contracts. The worst they could do was talk, and talk they did. But eventually, even that lost its sting. They can keep my name in their mouths, Lila said with a small, tired smile one day. At least it means they remember what I refused to become. Slowly, she began to rebuild a life that felt like hers again. She called the gallery owner she'd postponed on and asked if her exhibit slot was still open. She started wearing her hair the way she liked it, not the way Regina had said was more appropriate. She laughed louder, her full body laugh, the one that filled a room instead of apologizing for existing in it. She spent time with friends who remembered the version of her from before the engagement, people who didn't try to puzzle piece her into their own expectations. And I, for the first time in years, let myself rest. Not because everything was perfect, but because the fight had finally shifted from keeping my daughter safe inside someone else's world to supporting her as she built one of her own. I thought about all the times I'd told myself that keeping quiet was the only way to hold our place at their table. Now I understood that some tables aren't worth sitting at, no matter how fine the china looks. My silence hadn't been meaningless. It had been a strategy, born of fear and love tangled together. But the moment I hit that record button, the moment I packed that overnight bag, the moment I whispered your life first at the altar, those were the moments when silence stopped being protection and started being a cage. Stepping out of it wasn't clean or pretty. It tore through expectations, reputations, and carefully curated facades. Yet, as the dust settled, what remained was simple and solid. My daughter, whole and free, standing in her own life. Now, when I choose silence, it's different. It's not the silence of swallowing insults or shrinking myself to keep the peace. It's the silence of peace I've created, of boundaries I've drawn, of knowing I can walk away from anyone who tries to turn my love into submission. It's the quiet that comes from understanding I don't need to plead for respect from people who measure worth by surfaces and status. One evening, Lila and I walked past a bridal boutique downtown. In the window, a mannequin stood dressed in a gown not unlike the one she'd almost married in. She paused, looked at it for a long moment, then turned to me with a small, steady smile. "I'm not afraid of that anymore," she said. "Marriage, weddings, any of it. I'm just not willing to disappear for it.
I looped my arm through hers. Good, I replied, because anyone who gets you is going to have to meet you at your full height or not at all.
As we walked on, the reflection of the window followed us for a few steps. A mother and daughter. No veil, no aisle, no audience. Just two women who had walked through the fire of other people's expectations and come out on the other side, not untouched, but unbroken. Revenge, in the end, wasn't about seeing Regina fall or watching her reputation crumble. Those were just aftershocks. The real victory was quieter and far more lasting. My daughter's laughter returning to its full volume, the light in her eyes no longer dimmed to make anyone else comfortable, the way she now says no without apologizing for it. And as for me, I carry one lesson like a promise. My voice will never again disappear in rooms where my worth or my child's worth is being measured. If I choose silence, it will be on my terms, in my peace, not in service of someone else's illusion of superiority. Because that day at the altar, when my daughter's hand shook in mine and she whispered that she was scared, I realized something simple and unshakable. Her life had to come first. And once we chose that, truly chose it, every step away from that hall was not an escape, but an entrance into a future where she belonged fully to herself.